We have been discussing about the paper Introduction to Philosophy, which is introduced to the first semester students of University of Delhi for the UGCF NEP syllabus from the Department of Philosophy. We continue discussing further the Unit 4, which is to do with social contract, justice and scientific temper. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now that we had been talking about the social contract, the concept of justice and the scientific temper, let us pick up some of the philosophers who have been popularly engaged with the social contract theory and connect it with the ideal theory. For example, Rawls and the turn to ideal theory. Now, John Rawls reformulates the contract. He uses the original position and veil of ignorance. He focuses on fair principles of justice, not historical processes alone. The strength is that he avoids biasness by abstracting from identity. He provides a normative benchmark for justice. The limitation, however, is that Rawls explicitly prioritizes ideal theory. He assumes strict compliance. He brackets historical injustice. And the result is that Rawls tells us what a just society should look like, but not how to repair unjust histories. So the problem is basically to start fresh. Social contract frameworks often imply, for example, within quotes, let us imagine we are equals and agree on fair terms. But historically, nobody was equal. People were never equal to begin with, and inequalities are accumulated and inherited. This leads to what critics call moral amnesia, ignoring past injustices, reproducing them in the present. Similarly, the social contract theory focuses on individual consent, rational agreement, but historical injustices are collective. They are institutional. They often it's unconscious or normalized. Consent cannot justify colonial rule, cannot justify caste oppression, and definitely not gender subordination. So when we expand this framework vis-a-vis the critical intervention, we see there is something called the rectificatory justice, that is building on Locke's idea of property, which later thinkers argue that if holdings arise from injustice, they require rectification. But Locke himself, who justified property through labor, was implicated in colonial contexts. His framework lacks tools to address systematic disposition. Now, with the Rawlsian extensions, we see that later Rawls introduces the non-ideal theory, which focuses on transitional justice. Still, the challenge remains: how far back should rectification go? Who is responsible for past wrongs? Then comes the capability approach. Amartya Sen shifts the focus from ideal justice to actual injustices, from institutions to human capabilities. His contribution has largely been when he addresses lived consequences of historical injustice. He focuses on removing real deprivations. This is a move away from contractarian abstraction towards ethical realism. Drawing from Duncan Pritchard and broader epistemic debates, the historical injustice includes epistemic justice, silencing voices, erasing knowledge systems. Social contract theory assumes equal rational agents but ignores unequal access to knowledge and recognition. Now, in the Indian philosophical intervention, D.P. Chattopadhyay offers a crucial insight. Reason is historically situated, not abstract. Scientific temper must engage with social realities. The implication is that justice cannot be ahistorical. Rationality must confront tradition, power, and inequality. Now, towards a reconstruction of social contract to account for historical injustice, the theory must be transformed from hypothetical to historical. Recognize that contracts are embedded in real histories. It includes memory, reparations, and acknowledgement. From consent to power, analyze how consent may be coerced, manufactured, and structurally constrained. From equality assumption to inequality correction, begin from actual asymmetries, incorporate affirmative justice measures. From static to dynamic justice, justice as ongoing processes, not one-time agreement. So, the concerns now, some of them which are palpable are, can social contract theory account for historical injustice? Well, the response could be something like it does provide a normative ideal of fairness but fails to explain unjust histories, address inherited inequalities, and recognize structural domination. However, when revised through non-ideal theory, capability approach epistemic justice, historically grounded reason, it can become a critical tool not for justifying the present but for transforming it. Thus, a contract that forgets history risks legitimizing injustice. A theory of justice that remembers history becomes a project of repair. The question then, is Rawls' theory practical in unequal societies? For it forces us to examine the tension between normative idealism and historical social reality. Rawls offers one of the most dynamic and influential accounts of justice, but is applicability and in deeply unequal societies, which is marked by caste, race, class, gender hierarchies, and more, remains philosophically contested. So Rawls' project, which has been an ideal theory as moral architecture, we see that this framework rests on two key devices: the original position, which has been a hypothetical choice situation, and the veil of ignorance, where agents are unaware of their social position. From this, he derives equal basic liberties, social and economic inequalities justified only if they benefit the least advantaged. They are attached to fair equality of opportunity, and Rawls is not just describing reality, he is constructing a moral blueprint for a just society. The core challenge then is the deep inequality as the starting point. In unequal societies, individuals are not free and equal in any meaningful sense. Social positions are shaped by historical injustice. Power asymmetries distort institutions and opportunities. Rawls thus assumes fair agreement amongst equals, but reality presents structured inequality amongst unequals. This creates a gap between ideal principles and practical conditions. But still, the defense of Rawls still matters because largely for the normative guidance. Rawls, however, provides a standard of justice against which institutions can be evaluated, a way to critique inequality as unjust if it does not benefit the least advantaged. Even in unequal societies, Rawls helps us say this inequality is not justifiable. The institutional design policies inspired by Rawls include welfare redistribution, affirmative action as extension of fair opportunity, progressive taxation, and his theory can guide incremental reforms even if full realization is distant. Some of the major critiques, which are limits in unequal contexts, again has been ideal versus non-ideal theory. Rawls prioritizes ideal theory. Rawls assumes compliance. He ignores unjust starting points. Critics argue we need non-ideal theory, how to move from injustice to justice. Without this, Rawls risks being utopian. Historical injustice and structural inequality, where Rawls does not adequately addresses colonialism, slavery, caste systems, and these are not accidental inequalities but historically produced structures. The difference principles redistributes benefits, but does it repair historical wrongs? Does it dismantle entrenched hierarchies? Often the answer is no. The problem of power, Rawls assumes rational deliberation, fair institutions, but in reality elites shape institutions. Marginalized groups lack voice. Justice cannot emerge from fair agreement if the conditions of agreement are themselves unjust. Capability critique, where Amartya Sen argues Rawls focuses on primary goods resources, but people convert resources into well-being differently. Example, two individuals with equal resources, one may be disabled or socially oppressed, hence unequal capability to benefit. Justice must focus on actual freedoms, not just distribution. Epistemic critique, drawing from Duncan Pritchard and broader epistemic concerns, Rawls assumes agents can reason impartially, but unequal societies produce ignorance, biasness, and epistemic exclusion. The veil of ignorance is philosophically elegant, but socially people cannot easily detach from internalized hierarchies. Contextual rationality, D.P. Chattopadhyay emphasizes reason is historically and culturally embedded. Scientific temper must engage with social realities, and Rawls' abstraction risks ignoring context, universalizing a Western liberal model. Can Rawls be made practical? Yes, but only through modification and supplementation. Incorporating non-ideal theory, where it focuses on transitional justice, addresses injustice step by step, and includes repercussions and corrective policies. Expanding the difference principle, which is not just by redistribution but structural transformation, which is to do with land reform, social recognition, and institutional restructuring. So the integrating capability approach, when we combine Rawls with Amartya Sen, we see that there can be a shift from goods to real freedoms. And embedding scientific temperament of D.P. Chattopadhyay and others, we see that they encourage critical reasoning in citizens, challenging inherited hierarchies. Here Rawls converges with democratic rationality and ethical critique. So the question then, or the philosophical resolution of, is Rawls practical? The strict answer would perhaps something be like not fully in its original ideal theoretical form, but if we want to qualify this answer, we can perhaps say yes as a normative framework guiding reform if adapted to real conditions. Rawls gives us a moral compass, not a roadmap. Without adaptation, it remains abstract, and with contextual grounding, it becomes transformative. In unequal societies, justice cannot begin behind a veil that hides difference. It must begin by confronting difference, history, and power directly. To ask how scientific temper can be democratized, it is to move from seeing it as a method of science to understanding it as a method of being in society, an ethical, epistemic and political disposition that must be shared, not monopolized. Going ahead, when we discuss about the philosophical grounding of scientific temperament, we must understand that this is not merely doing experiments, scientific or otherwise, or following scientific method. It is a normative disposition which is to do with critical inquiry, skepticism towards authority, openness to revision and commitment to evidence and reason. D.P. Chattopadhyay argues that scientific temper is historically and culturally embedded. It must engage with social realities, not remain abstract. Therefore, democratization means making rationality a shared cultural practice, not an elite privilege. So, the question then is, the problem that we see is why scientific temper is not already democratic. Number one, epistemic inequality. Access to education is unequal. Knowledge institutions are hierarchical. Certain voices are privileged over others. The result, epistemic injustice. Some are not even heard, testimonial injustice. Some cannot articulate experiences, hermeneutical injustice. Second, when we go ahead to see if the democratizing of the scientific temper, we must rethink these three dimensions. Epistemic, who can know? Drawing on epistemology of Pritchard-like concerns, knowledge requires justification, trust and intellectual virtue. Democratization means expanding epistemic agency, recognizing multiple knowers. Not only experts know, but all can participate in knowing, though not all knowledge is equal. The ethical concern then, who gets to question? Scientific temper requires freedom to doubt, freedom to dissent. Democratic condition, protection of intellectual autonomy, encouragement of critical dialogue. Without ethical freedom, rationality becomes conformity. Political, who controls knowledge? Knowledge is tied to power. Institutions like universities, media, state shape narratives. Dominant groups control legitimate knowledge. The democratization requires decentralization of knowledge production, public engagement with science, and transparency and accountability. Bridging science and society, public science communication, citizen science initiatives, open access to knowledge breaks the divide between expert knowledge and everyday understanding. Cultivating intellectual virtues from an epistemic virtue perspective, humility, that is, recognizing limits, courage, questioning authority, open-mindedness, scientific temper becomes an ethical character, not just cognitive skill. Engaging tradition critically, we see that following Chattopadhyay, who had said that do not reject tradition outright, reinterpret traditions through rational critique. For example, the Indian logical traditions, Nyaya, as resources for reasoning. Institutional reform make academia less hierarchical, encourage interdisciplinary thinking, protect academic freedom. Institutions must embody justice, rationality and inclusivity. However, there are tensions and limits. Relativism versus rationality. If all voices are included, thus truth becomes relative. The response is democratization is not equivalent to relativism. Standards of evidence remain, but access to reasoning expands. Expertise versus participation. Science requires specialization and balance is its respects expertise enable public reasoning. The tensions and limits, rationality versus emotion. Human beings are not purely rational. Scientific temper must integrate ethical sensitivity and emotional intelligence. In the Indian context of philosophical opportunity, scientific temper is a constitutional duty Yet social hierarchicals persist. Chattopadhyay's contribution, where rationality must be historically grounded, socially engaged, and the India can model a synthesis of tradition plus critique plus democratic reasoning. So, what does it then mean to democratize scientific temper? Basically, it means transforming society such that everyone has the capacity to question, everyone has the right to reason, everyone participates in shared inquiry. Thus, scientific temper becomes democratic not when science is popularized, but when reason itself becomes a public practice, which is lived, shared, and contested. What is epistemic justice? This is one of the terms which is most closely associated with Miranda Fricker, who identifies two central forms: testimonial injustice, where a speaker's credibility is unjustly deflated due to prejudice like caste, gender, class bias, and hermeneutical injustice, where there is a gap in collective interpretive resources that prevents someone from making sense of their experience. Epistemic justice demands fair recognition of individuals as knowers, equal participation in meaning-making practices. Why education is a crucial site? Education is not neutral, and we must understand that it is a structured epistemic environment where knowledge is selected, curriculum. Authority is distributed, teacher versus student. Voices as legitimized or silenced. Therefore, education can either reproduce epistemic injustice or act as a site of epistemic repair. Now, about the philosophical dimensions of epistemic justice in education, we can have ontological, where the student as the knower. Traditional education treats students as passive recipients. Epistemic justice redefines them as active epistemic agents. Every learner begins with lived experience, cultural knowledge, interpretive frameworks. Denying this is a form of epistemic injustice. What counts as knowledge? Mainstream education often privileges canonical Western formal knowledge while marginalizing indigenous knowledge, oral traditions. Thus, knowledge, as for taking the briefs from Chattopadhyay, is historical and culturally embedded. Scientific temper must engage diverse traditions critically. Epistemic justice requires pluralizing knowledge without collapsing standards of reasoning. Thus, ethical is basically recognition and respect, where epistemic injustice is fundamentally moral harm, and being disbelieved is loss of dignity, being misunderstood is alienation. Thus, the ethical demand is respect students as credible informants, foster intellectual dignity. And the political, the power and knowledge. Knowledge systems are shaped by power. Curriculum reflects dominant ideologies. Language of instruction privileges certain groups. Institutional hierarchies silences dissent. Epistemic justice involves redistributing epistemic power. The role of epistemic justice in education: correcting testimonial injustice. Teachers must critically examine biases. Classrooms participation must be inclusive. For example, encouraging marginalized students to speak. Taking their contributions seriously builds epistemic confidence. Addressing the hermeneutical gaps. Expand interpretive frameworks in curriculum. Introduce concepts that help students articulate lived realities. For example, gender studies enabling articulation of discrimination, social theory explaining structured inequality. Education becomes a space of self-understanding. About the cultivating epistemic virtues, drawing from epistemology like Duncan Pritchard, there can be intellectual humility, open-mindedness, critical reflection, and these are essential for scientific temper, democratic reasoning. So, enabling dialogical pedagogy, we need to shift from monologue to dialogue. Knowledge emerges through interaction. Classroom then can become a mini public sphere where there is a site of shared reasoning. Democratizing knowledge, where epistemic justice aligns with accessibility, open resources, inclusivity, diverse voices, participation, student engagement, and knowledge is no longer owned by elites but co-created socially. However, there are also challenges and tensions like relativism versus standards. Thus, recognizing multiple knowledge undermine truth. The resolution could be maintain standards of evidence and reasoning but expand who participates in knowledge production. Authority versus equality. Teachers possesses expertise. The balance could be authority as guidance, not domination, and encourage questioning without collapsing rigor. Also, there can be structural constraints in the form of exam systems, institutional hierarchies, language barriers. Epistemic justice requires systematic reform, not just individual goodwill. And there are more such connects and links to the concept of the contract theory, the social contract theory, justice and scientific temperament. We will be connecting more in our next class. Thank you.